Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm delighted to say I'm here with Trent Hone, all the way from Virginia in the U.S. Trent is a naval historian, the author of this book, for those of you watching, The Learning War, The Evolution of Fighting Doctrine in the U.S. Navy, 1898 to 1945. And the reason that I got to know Trent is he also wrote a chapter in this book, Cyenfin, or is now known as Cyenfin 21, the book of the celebrating 21 years of the Cyenfin framework. And for those of you familiar with that, it's developed by Dave Snowden, who's been a regular on this podcast and a big influencer on my work in the field of complexity thinking and theory. So I guess the Venn diagram of naval history and Cyenfin and complexity thinking is what we're going to get to explore in this episode, I hope. So welcome, Trent.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Very pleased to be here.
Yeah, great. Now, I know pretty much zero of nothing of naval history or military history in general. So it was great actually to read this book and take a dive into a subject. I'm pretty unfamiliar with. I learned kind of lots of new jargon in the book, but I suppose what really came out was this idea of the kind of the softer human aspect to what I suppose tends to get stereotyped as quite a rigid institution, you know, whether it be the Navy or the Army or in any military. And so it's fascinating to me to understand the depth at which the leaders in these organizations were exploring human dynamics in pursuit of some level destroying other humans, but nonetheless, it was, it was.
There is an irony. There is an irony there, isn't there? Right. So the military has one of its core purposes is to win wars, which involves killing other people. But they have to use people to do it. So they have to become astute students of human nature and motivation, I think, as well. That was something that, as I get farther into it, fascinates me more and more. Because you're right, we do have sort of this sense of militaries being a certain way, being sort of rigid and doctrinal in a way where you're trying to push out conformity, right? Because when you're in a life or death, high pressure situation, sometimes behaving the right way, it makes a tremendous difference. But there has to be some flexibility that comes along with that, because you can't tell people, you know, and the Cyenfin framework, I think, is very good about this, particularly when it comes into thinking about the complex domain. You can't tell people how to behave based on what's going to emerge, because the future is unpredictable. So you have to equip them to be able to act for themselves. And I think as we look at military organizations, you can see a clear trend of trying to figure out how to get better at that through the years.
Yeah, equipping people. That's right. And this idea of doctrine and indoctrination, this is a really strong theme in this book, is that over time the Navy got, I suppose, more sophisticated in developing a doctrine that would work for them. The U.S. Navy, that is. And that word indoctrination has so much baggage with it that we tend to think of like re-education camps and cults, but I suppose in this context we're talking about something quite different. I wonder if we should open this conversation with, you know, what do we mean by doctrine and what's its important in the context of this idea of the learning war.
That's a great place to start, because one of the things that I was really fascinated by is in this time period, early in the time period of the book, the United States Navy is beginning to define doctrine for itself. And it's very different from the way many of us would define it, particularly if we're coming to it from like a religious aspect, where we're told, you know, this is the right behavior that you should employ, the right action that you should engage in. And instead, fairly young officer, a man named Lieutenant Commander Dudley Knox, was at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and began to think about, as fleets get larger in size and as it becomes more and more difficult to communicate directly with signal halyards and the like, how can you ensure concerted action in the absence of instructions or orders? How do you make sure that we can act cohesively? And he thought doctrine was the way to do this. And he was looking to the Prussian military, their success in the war against France in 1870, and some sort of more Native American ideas, not the indigenous people of the United States, but native in terms of native to the United States. And he felt that a good way to do this would be to just collect shared understanding through exercises, primarily tabletop exercises, which war games, which the Naval War College was doing quite a bit of. And through that, develop some habits, some norms of how we might behave if we were a group of officers challenged to bring our ships into a fight without being able to communicate. So you can develop a sense of how people are going to behave based on developing circumstances, establish some norms, and then bring out some more coherent action. And I think that's quite different from how we think about doctrine today, and even somehow some militaries think about doctrine today, because they've got a manual. Here's what it says you should do. When certain circumstances happen, turn to the right page in the manual, execute those steps. This is more develop a contextual understanding of your colleagues and the circumstances, and then act appropriately based on that.
Right. And right at the end of the book, you actually contrast the US Navy with the British Navy, where perhaps doctrine had come to mean something far more prescriptive and rigid. Talk about the Shadow of Trafalgar, right? This idea that, they've developed these habits of success, which have actually become their Achilles heel because they become too rigid, right? Whereas the US didn't have that history.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is fascinating about this history is there is the Battle of Jutland in 1916. The German Navy, the Royal Navy come together. The result, to some degree, is not wholly satisfying to the Royal Navy, right? Because there is this theme of Nelsonian victory, Trafalgar, and others, and that doesn't happen. And the U.S. Navy looked at it, right? There's the largest sea battle of World War I. What happened? How did it work? And one of the things they take from it is they think, the instructions given to subordinate commanders in the Royal Navy were probably too precise, didn't give them enough flexibility. So we want to avoid that. It's very clear that that's a line of thinking in the U.S. Navy. And that is interesting to me because it's a criticism that has been reawakened in recent years. There's a good book called The Rules of the Game by Andrew Gordon that basically that's what it's about. It looks at the evolution of battle tactics in the Royal Navy from more or less from Trafalgar to Jutland, and makes the argument that they became a little bit too rigid, a little bit too pre-planned, and that is not as effective in the complex emergent situation of a naval battle.
Right. And all of this, I mean, a lot of this, your book and this period of history centers around the Solomon Islands, this chain of islands, right? And the Pacific War. And it did struck me as we were talking about it that you've got this distributed sort of battle context, haven't you? And so perhaps at some level that call for a different approach to leadership and management of the fleet.
Yeah, the Solomons are fascinating because they show how some of the assumptions that the United States Navy, and I think the Navy of Imperial Japan as well, brings to the conflict, World War II in the Pacific, are wrong. They don't work out. And this is not surprising. A lot of times, organizations or militaries will go into a dynamic situation and their assumptions will be disproven. But it's particularly challenging for the U.S. Navy's approach because they've assumed that some of their formations will be relatively static. And the approach to doctrinal development that Knox introduced relies on that, right? So if you and I are part of a destroyer division, we should be expected to get together periodically, understand how we're going to fight together. We might have some plans about the range we were going to open fire at or how the maneuvers we might use. But there is some doctrine that's built through that familiarity that we're expected to develop. And because of the pressures of war in the Atlantic and the Pacific, the United States Navy can't keep those formations together. They're not cohesive anymore. So instead of you and I having months or years of familiarity with each other, we might have met each other yesterday. And now we have to go figure out how to fight. And if you've ever played a really talented, practiced team as like a pickup group, say you go to the football pitch and you're trying to play, Manchester United with just your buddies who go to the pub every day, you're gonna lose. You're just not gonna do well, no matter how athletically talented you are. And it's a similar situation. It's a pickup team on the U.S. Navy side versus a more practiced team often on the side of Japan. and the results are in some ways as you would expect. And the U.S. Navy falls back on just what I call heuristics. So rather than a cohesive plan, it's how do we fight? What are the approaches that we have built in over the years to try to figure out how to act at battle? And they emphasize opening fire with their guns very quickly, very early. Radar gives some advantage in that capability, but they can't make sense of the battle around them, and their formations disintegrate, and it's very problematic. But that leads to some innovations. I could go into that, but I want to give you a chance to inject and see if there's somewhere else you want to steer the conversation.
No, I think let's talk about it. But I just remember it's Admiral Pye, right? He's sort of criticizing, hasn't he, some of the failures in this campaign in the Pacific, and he talks about no planning and no indoctrination. And I'm very familiar with that idea that you need to have some level of planning, but this also this idea that we need to have this indoctrination, I suppose, is a bit less familiar perhaps to people to think in those terms. You've all heard, piss poor preparation predicts poor performance or whatever, right? But you don't hear sort of piss poor indoctrination is going to cause you a problem, right? So I'm just, I suppose, very sort of emphasizing for me that was something I picked up on.
Yes. So at that time, Pye he was commander of the battle force at the time of Pearl Harbor, and commands the Pacific Fleet momentarily after Admiral Kimmel was relieved for a couple of weeks. But then he goes eventually to the Naval War College. He's president of the Naval War College through much of the war. And so, he's commenting on this, and lack of plans, lack of indoctrination. This is a problem. And many historians prior to what I was doing have come at that and looked at it and said, oh, there wasn't a doctrine. We didn't have a doctrine in the U.S. Navy to fight at night combat. That's sort of the conclusion that they've reached. And it's more subtle than that. It's these formations and then the officers within them didn't have time to develop a doctrine, because that's what they were expected to do. There are standard operating approaches for night combat, like the emphasis on gunfire that I said before. That was one of the things that the U.S. Navy emphasized. At night, as soon as you see a target, open fire. Don't bother taking the range. Try to figure out the range by where the shell splashes land relative to the target.
Just start firing. Right.
Yeah, just start shooting. Because at that time, sighting ranges are relatively short. They're so close that the ships have the capability of knocking each other out of action in just a few minutes, and they do. So this lack of indoctrination is problematic, but it's problematic because the formations are cohesive. But the other major problem is there are so many new sensor capabilities. I mentioned radar. That's a new thing. And I think this is quite logical in hindsight, but it leads to a problem. The U.S. Navy channelized radar development in terms of existing organizational structures and policies. So you had two technical bureaus, one which was the Bureau of Ordnance, and they're responsible for guns and armor. So they take radar. They say, all right, we're going to use radar to control the guns better. We'll develop radars that allow us to determine the range to an enemy target and make the gunfire more precise. Cool. And then there's the Bureau of Ships, or what had been before that, the Bureau of Construction and Repair and the Bureau of Steam Engineering. They combined to form the Bureau of Ships, and they're responsible for search radars. What is the world around us? Let's look at other ships. Let's look at land formations, and let's help navigation, because that is more within our sphere. So you get ships that have these various radar suites that the information of which is being channeled through the various departments, and it results in confusion because there's no centralized processing mechanism aboard the ship to make sense of all this information until it gets to the captain's brain. And the captain has to try to figure out on the fly what's going on. And there aren't standard terms for discussing what radar contacts are or reporting the range to them. And if you go through and read some of these action reports and try to put yourself in the position of some of these officers, you can realize, wow, this must have been horribly frustrating and confusing, because the world is chaotic around them. They're not getting the information they need, or they're getting too much information. It's obvious from the commands that they then issue that they're not making sense of it. And then they don't have a doctrine to fall back on, a sort of a cohesive way of how we are going to go into battle and fight together. And the beneficial thing is they write these kinds of things fairly honestly in action reports. So if they are fortunate enough to survive, they write down their experiences, they record what happened, they describe it. And this comes back up through the command hierarchy. And eventually it starts to get, well, not eventually, relatively quickly, it gets to the staff of the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. And he and his staff start looking at this and there's a problem here, right? We've got radar, we've got information, but we're not making sense of it. Now, they don't exactly use those terms. I'm using those terms because we're familiar with them now. And they start saying, well, we got to do radar better. And in the midst of the Solomon battles in November 1942, they come out with a new guidance. I think it's a letter that basically says, look, all the ships in the fleet, you've got to create something. And initially they say you've got to create a combat operations center. It gets changed to combat information center, or CIC. Go make one of these. And what I love about this order is it's only a couple of pages long, and it says what that group is going to do, what your CIC is going to do. Gather all the information, make sense of it, and then provide it in an actionable format to the command function of the ship and its weapons. But staff, Nimitz and his staff, don't say how. They say, go do this, go figure it out. And why I thought this was a great story to include in the Cyenfin book is because what that springs, you can see how this fits the probe, sense, respond guidance for the complex domain, because it's parallel experimentation. All the different ships start figuring out, well, how are we going to make a CIC? What room are we going to use for it? Or compartment? What compartment is going to get turned into the CIC? Who's going to be in there? How are we going to do this? And all that parallel experimentation allows a broader search through different options and alternatives that is contextually sensitive to the ship type. So, destroyers, which are small and not well armored, but fast, and they have guns and torpedoes, develop a different sort of approach to creating a CIC than battleships, which are larger, generally slower, much more heavily armored, and have much more powerful guns. Because the ship types are different, the kinds of ways in which they'll probably fight are different, and so they take different approaches to creating CICs. And the way that the order is issued, without a lot of specific guidance, desired outcomes, but not how to get there, fosters that. And I think it's a really neat story for us, even now, because so often, so many of us who are in positions of authority think, well, I've got to provide some guidance on how to do this. Otherwise it's going to be chaos.
Right. Yeah. Or how can I possibly trust these guys to get it right? Like just off the bat. Right.
Right.
Maybe we should go create some prototypes, work out how to do it in a lab or whatever the equivalent would be in the Navy, and then roll it out. Right. That's a predictable sort of linear way of thinking.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. Figure it out in the lab and then roll it out. But when you roll it out, lab's different. Not the same. And you're going to run into problems. And it doesn't, all the initial attempts don't work. I mean, I don't want listeners to think that Nimitz provides this instruction and then all these experiments are brilliant. I mean, some of them don't work out well. There's a whole series of additional fighting in the Solomon Islands through about the middle of 1943, where the U.S. Navy is working out its approaches to the Combat Information Center and how to make it work. And some of those don't work for a while.
Right. But, and you referred to Nimitz as I don't know, a pioneer, not a pioneer, but somebody who provided for a great deal of psychological safety. And you hear it in that story, right? That he's making it safe for people to fail. He's opening it up, and implicitly or explicitly, he must have been telling, and it's okay if some of you get it wrong initially, right?
Yeah. There's a patience to the way he commands, which I think is really interesting. And there are anecdotes that I didn't include in the book. They're going to be in a forthcoming work about how he approached command. I do think I included in there his willingness to, well, not just willingness, but the way he liked to introduce himself to new captains. Because throughout much of the war he was based in Pearl Harbor, and new ships on their way to the Pacific would stop there, and he would invite the captains to come see him, just for a few minutes, just so that he could get a sense of who they are. but also I think to impress upon them this idea that he had confidence in them, that he trusted them,
Right.
that he expected them to use their skill and creativity to the fullest. And I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we sometimes, well, it's important to emphasize in this, I suppose, this leadership strategy that we're talking about in complexity, where we say there are these enabling constraints. And in this case, you might say it was the parameters of this kick the CIC that he'd outlined. And then obviously the constraints of each ship in order to implement it. But also the trust, right? You've got to have a kind of high level of trust to allow people to go out and run these parallel experiments, which you expect some of which to fail. And I think that's something it's worth emphasizing, and this underpinned by this psychological safety idea.
Absolutely, yeah. There's got to be. I love that you're bringing enabling constraints in it. It's amusing to me. We broadly, I have seen sort of Twitter arguments about like what is actually an enabling constraint versus a governing constraint or a top-down constraint, and I feel like some of that misses the point because it has to be very contextual, right? And I prefer to just think about what are the constraining elements, and yes, ship types, the war itself is a constraining element, but the culture that Nimitz tries to create, where it is okay to have some failure, it is okay to make some experimentation. Learn from it, though, right? That is an important piece of it, and you can see that. You can see in how officers are treated. They are allowed to have some experiments that don't work out, but if they make a mistake repeatedly, or if they make a mistake that Nimitz or someone else feels like they probably shouldn't have made, given the knowledge that they had or the knowledge that had already been gained, then they probably get routed somewhere else. So
right,
Yeah. Amy Edmondson makes that point in her the Fearless Organization book that you sort of have two different approaches to mistakes. There's the failures that result from lack of knowledge. And there you want to celebrate the knowledge that got gained and don't punish the people. And then there are the mistakes that result from sort of not conforming to standards that we've established as an organization. And there you want to make sure that that's not allowed. That's not the kind of behavior that we want. So psychological safety has its boundaries, but I think if you draw that distinction clearly, and you can think about it, right? Like in today's environment, you want to make sure that people are experimenting and pushing the boundaries of their knowledge to help the organization. But if they're harassing their colleagues, if they're behaving like jerks, you want to get them out, because that diminishes the overall psychological safety.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And what's that line? Autonomy without accountability is just a vacation, right? Yeah, there's got to be some boundaries. Yeah. But the other thing you mentioned here, I think is really important, is after action reports, like this honest appraisal of what happened, what went wrong at a factual level. And we had another guy who worked in bomb disposal, a guy called Ben Sawyer, who came on the podcast, and he emphasized that in bomb disposal operations, it was a habit, right? They would always write the report, and they would always spend time together as a team. And this is obviously much tighter teams in bomb disposal, and go over honestly what had happened and, the wash up afterwards. And of course, that's now becoming an established practice in terms of software teams and with the agile community. But from my understanding, this has been a core element of sort of military culture, for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yes. One of the things that I think is quite interesting, though, is how it's fairly standardized in terms of the template that the U.S. Navy employed. Like what sections are we going to write to? There's a great deal of variability, especially early in the war. You'll get ship captains who will write 20 pages. You'll get others who will write 3.
Right.
So the level of fidelity varies a good deal. That becomes a bit more standardized later in the war as staff get larger and there's sort of a greater sense of what we should be doing or what we should be capturing. But that's interesting to me. And
right. And do you think that indicates a certain level of gaming with those reports and us covering, or is it just
there are definitely documents that read that way. that, I mean, there are others where it's like you'll get someone who's relatively junior filling it out because the more senior officers aboard the ship didn't survive, and those are fairly raw, you know, very much, I think, accurate descriptions, best as could be remembered of what happened. And you get other ones that are a bit more. Wouldn't go so far as to sort of, you know, say they're CYA, but they're sort of putting people in the best light. They're not as frank. They're not as honest an assessment.
Right. But they were coming back in relation to the CICs. Did those start to come back, and that was one of the drivers of the evolution of it?
Oh, absolutely. There are a number of different feedback loops which get triggered. One of the ones which is hardest to trace is the kind of in the combat zone collaboration that occurs, because, you know, captains will come back to a port and the other members of the ship, and they'll get together and they'll talk. And so procedures were improving that way, right? Well, you know, what did you do? How did you track things? Where did you put the radar? And there's an evolution there that you can see hints of in the action reports. But the action reports are a more formalized mechanism. They come back. And so there are schools that are set up. They're usually called radar schools, but really what they are sort of educational institutions around how to train officers to work in or run combat information centers. And the information from the action reports feeds back into those. And the mechanism, one of the mechanisms that's used to improve those, the Navy called them type commands. So type of ship. So there's a destroyer type command, a cruiser type command, and those review the action reports, look at the procedures, and then feed that back into sort of more standard manuals that get issued. And through that mechanism and the training of the schools, you can see how combat information center procedures begin to sort of channelize into the best approaches that emerge. And so by a year after Nimitz's instructions, by November 1943, the situation has turned around. The formations are more cohesive, so that helps, but the procedures are there. And so the Navy knows how to use the capabilities on hand. And although Japanese techniques have also evolved, they haven't evolved quite as rapidly. And the Navy wins 2 victories that month, November 1943, that really illustrate how the situation at night has changed, and the Japanese now have a significant disadvantage.
Right, and as a large part due to this evolution of these combat information centers on the ships and their ability to coordinate, and the doctrine around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the doctrine that emerges around that from having formations that are more cohesive, and then the policies for using it, and it gives. I feel like I've sort of skipped over this because I assume it's known, but what it gives is the captains and the officers aboard these ships a very clear sense of the world around them, right? The radars can be used to track not only friendly ships, but enemy ships. So you can operate them much more like you would if you had visibility, if you could see.
Right.
And so the coordinated use of distributed formations becomes possible. What the Navy was doing in 1942 is trying to keep formations cohesive so that they were together in a concentrated bunch. And that restricts your ability to use guns and torpedoes together. And by 1943, they've learned how to have coordinated actions with multiple formations. So you could close the enemy with one group and fire torpedoes before opening fire, before revealing your position. And then at about the time the torpedoes are expected to arrive, you can open fire with the other group with their guns, and not exactly a crossfire, but it's akin to one, right? Because the enemy is subjected to 2 types of attacks simultaneously, and it worked very well.
Right. And why is it that so many of these attacks were happening at night?
Well, that is an excellent question. A lot of it has to do with air power, right? The airplanes are becoming much more effective. The initial fighting in the Solomons happens at night because the Allies, the United States and its allies, seized the island of Guadalcanal, sort of in the southern portion of the Solomons chain. The Japanese had been building an airfield there, hadn't been completed. The Allies who land there complete it. And so they have effective dominion over the skies of the island during the day. The nearest Japanese land plane base is at Rabaul, which is, sort of at the northwestern tip of the Solomon chain. And it's a very long distance. Their planes can range, but they cannot loiter over the island for a long time. And so any Japanese ships that are coming to the island will be subjected to aerial attack. So they will close it during the daylight hours, but still remain fairly far away, and then try to approach it at night to land reinforcements or to bombard the airfield and to try to damage the airplanes there. And U.S. Navy ships try to stop them. So there's a lot of fighting at night. And this sort of theme carries through a lot of that fighting in the Solomon Islands.
Right. And I guess the importance of having, obviously radar and other means of detecting ships at night, becomes paramount. And then this other, how does this doctrine, because the opposing doctrine, from what I understand from reading this from the Japanese side, is one of at least is one of surprise, right? That stealth and surprise, is that right? And how did that play in?
Well, the Japanese are at a serious disadvantage through the years leading up to World War II because they have been restricted by treaty. Their battle line must be smaller. So for every 5 battleships that the U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy are allowed, the Japanese are only allowed 3. And so they look for ways in which to overcome this numerical deficiency. And one of the things that they concentrate on is, we can figure out, we can use technological solutions to address this. And one of the technological solutions they hit on is a very powerful and very long-range torpedo, the Type 93. It uses oxygen as its, instead of air, to burn its fuel. And that gives it an extremely long range. It has a very powerful warhead. And their theory is, they have 2 theories for using this. One is, if there's an opposing fleet coming toward us or advancing into our area of the ocean, we will try to attack it at night, a surprise attack at night, not from really long range, but we will stay a little bit more distant than they expect and rely on the long range of our torpedoes. So we'll try to do this stealthily at night, and then during the day, if there is a major action between battle lines, we will fire these torpedoes from long range to surprise the enemy at distances from which they would not anticipate a torpedo attack. And the first of those becomes a pattern that they can employ in the fighting in the Solomons. And yes, they don't have radar that is as sophisticated. They don't develop the kinds of procedures to use it, but they do have they have trained very extensively to fight at night. They have very good night vision devices, very experienced lookouts. And many times, particularly if the moon is up, in these night battles, they are able to sight the Allied ships before U.S. Navy radar makes sense of them or notices that they're there. And they capitalize on that advantage. And many times they capitalize on that advantage with torpedoes.
Right.
And, it's a weapon you can just sort of fire and forget it. Now, they're not guided torpedoes at the time, right? So they just go straight ahead. They go where you pointed them. But as long as the opposing line doesn't maneuver, which, they have a greater chance of that because of the high speed of their torpedoes, they can inflict terrible damage. And they do on a regular basis.
Right. So the other question I've got here is, how does the in practice, so we're developing this doctrine, particularly around the Combat Information Center. How does it actually happen? Are they like flying people back to like naval college and like sheet dumping? Like how does that process of indoctrination work? I'm interested.
The movement of people is very important. So the same month that November 1942, that Nimitz issues this instruction about, every ship of the fleet will create this combat operations or combat information center. One of the ships in one of the battles off Guadalcanal, the captain and his executive officer, it's a destroyer. They've worked out sort of a rudimentary combat information center. And Wiley is the name of the executive officer. And he basically tries to make sense of everything himself. He stands with one foot inside the radar room so he can see a radar display. He's got his other foot in the spot where he can, sort of verbally issue commands to the bridge and others. And he helps that ship navigate through the battle unscathed. And this goes into the action reports. And then when that happens, the people back at Pearl Harbor who are thinking, how are we going to create combat information centers? They notice and they say, you, Wiley, come back, come back here, come out of the combat area. you've got some great ideas. Let's use you to help establish one of these schools and educate others. All right. So the action reports become a mechanism to highlight not only effective practices, but also people who have introduced those practices. And sometimes they get handpicked and moved around. And the other thing that I think is interesting about this is there are conferences that are regularly occurring between the Atlantic Fleet and the Pacific Fleet. The U.S. Navy's organization at this time keeps them somewhat separate. They have different command structures, but they recognize they have a similar challenge. Now, in the Pacific, it's fighting the Imperial Japanese Navy. In the Atlantic, it's much more about fighting German U-boats. But both of these have a requirement for being able to make sense of emergent information rapidly and in an effective way, and do it not just within a ship, but within a formation, a group of ships. And so there are CIC conferences that bring groups from those different fleets together to talk about, well, what are you doing? How are you solving this problem? And so there's an exchange of information on a regular basis to try to advance knowledge across both fleets, across the entire fleet.
Right. So you're kind of creating like sense making and knowledge sharing fora, right?
Yeah. And what I think is really interesting, now we could think about that and say, wow, they got it right, in the Second World War in the early 1940s. If you look at the immediate post-World War I period, one of the things the U.S. Navy does is they recognize, the experience of fighting the German U-boats in that war was challenging. We learned a lot. We need to capture some of the lessons. And they've created, at that point, the sort of the hotbeds of knowledge are the Naval War College in Newport. Then there is an Atlantic Fleet Destroyer Command on the East Coast. And in San Diego, there's a Pacific Fleet Destroyer Command. And these three groups regularly exchange information. I don't know if they had, I suspect they got together, but I can't remember off the top of my head if they had any conference that officially brought them all together. But they are exploring different subjects, regularly exchanging information and coalescing that into the first destroyer-based doctrinal manuals of the U.S. Navy that come out, I think it's 1921 that's issued. And so they're going back to a model that some of these officers who are now at the highest levels of command would have been familiar with or would have seen when they were younger. And I think that is something that we often overlook, is how these habits get inculcated. You see that as early on in your career, and you go back to the pattern because you felt it was successful.
Right. So in that period of reflection, they kind of clocked this need to be able to adapt more effectively and learn as they were fighting, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a context for it.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the media thought, did these like educational centers become targets? I mean, did the Allies, not the Allies, sorry, the enemy, cotton on to this?
Well, by this time, so this will be 1943, the Japanese have really lost the ability to be able to attack a place like Pearl Harbor, a place like Hawaii. I mean, there are going to be, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I mean, they have the capability for some sort of long-range pinprick kind of attack. I mean, they did produce these balloon bombs that would float across the Pacific and land in the Pacific Northwest. So, I mean, to say that they have no ability would probably be wrong, but no sort of systematic ability. There's not going to be another Pearl Harbor attack by 1943. They are too focused on trying to resist the Allied advance in the South and Southwest Pacific at that point. And the Germans, aside from submarine patrols along the eastern U.S. coast, don't have the ability for some sort of raid like that either.
Right. And the term that came to mind, you may be familiar with Nicholas Nassim Taleb, antifragile, right? Like if you damage something, an organism, to an extent that it's still alive or it survives, but it adapts as a result of that damage to such that it actually becomes stronger, right? A sort of post-traumatic growth idea, right? And I wondered to what extent that was true in the Solomon Islands. It almost like they either need to wipe them out, right? But the fact that they did enough damage, but left them, still operational and able to learn from it was was an example of anti-fragility on the part of the U.S. Navy. It just came to mind.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable take. I struggle to tease out the difference in my own head between what I would call sort of resilience and anti-fragility. I think there's a strong overlap there, but I'm familiar with Taleb's point, and I think you could argue that this is an example of that sort of thing. But what I think is very interesting is the U.S. Navy seems to be building this capability up, right? It's not something that they just have. It's consciously created in the years prior. There's a lot of emphasis in the interwar years on, I forget exactly how they put it, but some of the officers talk about, our greatest strength is sort of the intelligence, and today we might say adaptability, because that's the context that they're using it in, of our officers. We can think on our feet. We need to be able to train people to think on their feet. Exercises are designed to encourage that, right? So not a rote problem, but more of an emerging sequence of challenges that officers have to overcome. And so they're trying to build that talent up, and they consciously think that if they can do that, then they'll have an advantage. And I think it's because they have they recognize that war is going to be like that. Like it's not going to be predictable. They assume there's going to be a war in the Pacific against Japan. So there's going to be sort of this overarching strategy, right? We will somehow advance across the Pacific, bring the war to Japanese shores, and then force them to surrender. Now, beyond that, it does get a little bit more specific, but all of that is debatable through the years. But to do that, they recognize, well, we're gonna have to be able to overcome challenges that are going to emerge that we don't anticipate. And you see that repeatedly. So you see that with doctrine. They overcome some of the doctrinal challenges. Things don't work in the first year of war. A big unanticipated challenge has to do with logistics. There's a number of different books that have been written that investigate the development of underway replenishment and effective logistic practices in the Pacific. The Navy got, I think, a less effective handle on that prior to the war. But the Central Pacific advance that starts in late 1943 through like the Marshall and Mariana Islands, that would not have been possible without that sort of logistical support. And it's something that gets built primarily during the war. I mean, there's some thought about it beforehand, but it emerges.
Right. The other thing I thought was interesting to pick up on was again with these combat information centers, is that they develop this code to speak to each other. Right. That's one of the things that gets standardized as well. It's not just like developing specific doctrines for types of ships. It's also this language between them.
Yes, that's so important. And I think unless you sort of delve into the details of this, it's easy to dismiss. Like you and I are exchanging a lot of complex ideas and doing it very quickly. But there, time is even more essential. You can't have confusion, and the circuits, the radio circuits aboard a ship can become clogged very quickly, because it's not just two-way, like between you and I now. It may be 4- or 5-way. So if you're going to get on the circuit, you have to convey information very quickly, very precisely. You don't want to have to repeat it. And so there's language that they develop. It's an extension of an existing language. How do you say ranges? There's a very particular way to talk about ranges. There's a very particular way to talk about a radar contact, right? Is it a surface radar contact or an aerial radar contact? Different languages for the two, and all of that. And it has to be developed, because initially it's a little bit more fluid, particularly when it comes to radar. There's an example, I think I cited in the book, where during one of the battles, one of the ships refers to a surface radar contact as a bogey, and other ships that hear that think it's talking about an aerial contact, because for them, a bogey meant an airplane, not not a surface ship. And so confusion immediately. And then there are other terms that are sufficiently imprecise that also cause some confusion.
Right, the use of Roger. What was that? I can't remember the precise phrase, but yeah,
exactly. So this is actually the same battle. It's the Battle of Cape Esperance, and Rear Admiral Norman Scott is commanding the American group of ships, and he has not noticed because he's on a properly equipped flagship, but it doesn't have the most sophisticated radars, a cruiser San Francisco. So he hasn't fully become aware of the fact that there's a Japanese formation that's bearing down on him. The Japanese have not sighted the American ships yet, or have not recognized them as enemy yet. And the gunners and the captain of cruiser Helena, some distance farther back, knows what's going on, sees the Japanese ships. The gunners have them in their sights. And so at the time, Roger had two meetings. It was a code word for opening fire, and it was also a way that you could acknowledge the receipt of a message. So the captain of Helena sends to Scott, sends to San Francisco, essentially, hey, can I open fire? But the way they say it is, interrogatory Roger. They're basically, I'm asking for permission to open fire. That's what that means. That's what that means to them. Board San Francisco, radio operators receive it, and they want to send back message received. So they send back Roger. And that comes back to Helena, and they're like, we got permission, open up. And they do. And so from the back of the American line, these cruisers begin to open fire. And, because the gunners in San Francisco also have seen these targets and are also ready to open fire, they start shooting too, because, then the ship next to us started shooting. So let's get going. And Scott is thrown for a loop. What is going on? I didn't give permission to open fire. Well, you did. You didn't mean to, but your command system did. So that's the kind of confusion. And you can imagine, right? So Scott he knows there are contacts out there. He thinks they might be some of his own ships because of the formation that they just went through. He's not sure where some of his destroyers are. So he's concerned. They're shooting at each other. Meanwhile, his subordinates know what's going on. They feel on top of it, and they're on target. But that kind of confusion happens again and again until.
Go on, sorry.
Oh, I was going to say until you get more effective ways of dealing with this information, more effective ways to communicate, and formation commanders have the ability to make sense much more rapidly. They're not as confused before.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask. Did that result in them shooting each other?
Well, yes. So it's difficult without a visual, but for those who can watch, Scott's formation was going like this, and then it turned around, and the Japanese were coming this way. And some of his destroyers got caught in between the two lines of ships, and some of them were hit by both sides. Destroyer Fahrenheit, for example, I don't think any Japanese ships actually shot it, but it has or got holes in it from American shells. And you could tell that's what it was because it was going this way and the Americans were over here and the holes are on this side of the ship.
Yeah, right.
So its captain, figured out how to get out of that fast enough before the damage was too severe. But at the same time, they were more American shells hit Japanese ships than American ones. So
yeah,
it seemed the appropriate moment to open fire.
Right. And I just want to make sure I know this is, I've got a loop in my head now. So the phrase was interregnum something. What was it? Interregnum something, Roger?
Interrogatory. So basically, I'm asking a question, Roger, can I open fire is essentially what it means.
Can I open fire? Roger, like yes, question mark. And
right.
But he says Roger, but isn't that a yes coming back? Like, how is that not a yes?
Well, that was intended to be message received and understood. So
Roger, I see. Roger, I got your message, but exactly. I'm not going to give you a yes or no yet.
Yeah, exactly. It was right. Roger in terms of, I got your message. Thank you. Okay. But because the word that comes back is Roger, which is also, it means I got your message. Thank you. It also means open fire. They chose to interpret it the way naturally, I think, given their context. They were asking, can I open fire? They got open fire back. Off they go. Right.
But what surprised me, why wasn't that happening all the time? Because presumably that was quite like a common thing, or
I doubt that that specific set of circumstances evolved that way. I mean, I think it's odd how the Helena crew asked to open fire. I think that permission or that phrasing didn't get used very often.
Right.
Because you can, Roger it's a code word for opening fire. It works, or you can see how it might have worked better if you're doing signal flags. So there's a Roger signal flag, right? So you could raise it up, and then when it comes time to execute, you would lower it. So they're using language that predates the radios that they're using, and in the radios, it's more common to say can we open fire? You actually use those kinds of words rather than the code words, and that's where I think some of the confusion and the friction comes. They're in this sort of intermediate zone because the TBS radio set, the ultra high frequency radio set to communicate between ships, was relatively new, and they were working out procedures for using it. So it offers this capability of really talking back and forth like you and I are. Exchanging information rapidly over the radio waves, which they didn't have before, and had to be more coded. And so now
the codes that helped them in the past was that without tripping them up, right?
Yeah.
You could say, yeah, that makes sense. Now I definitely want to get to because I know your experience, with Exceler, right? So you're a fellow.
Yes.
And you're working with organizations, and I think there will be listeners who want to understand some of the ways you've sort of taken this wisdom into organizations. But before we get there, I just wanted to touch on the last part of the book when you start to get into this idea, again, when we're talking about doctrine of it being developed in the context of transcendental knowledge. And I have to admit, I sort of skimmed these last few pages before we got onto the call, but I wanted just to touch on that because you put it in sort of an historical context right at the end. And I wonder if we could explore that a bit.
Oh, yes. You're talking about the axial age and that sort of thing. Yeah. So I like how I did this. So this is getting back to Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan is often thought of as sort of the primal theorist or the father of American sea power or American sea power theory. And he's got a strong influence here. And one of the things that I think is unfortunate is Mahan is often associated with decisive battle doctrine. It is something that he cared about. But what I think his influence was more important for, at least in the context of the U.S. Navy, is establishing this idea that there are underpinning principles of naval warfare. There are these sort of long, enduring ideas, and he used historical study to try to draw them out. So he looks at he's famous for his work, the influence of sea power upon history, and the other things that derive from it. And he looks at the rise of Great Britain as a naval power in those works, and he uses it to tease out these principles. And the theory is that these are some core principles. If we understand them, then we'll be in better shape, but we need to know how to interpret them to context. So the naval officer in Mahan's thinking is sort of this bridge between these transcendental principles and context. And so the study of history is important because we can see how these principles have been applied before. And then we want to avoid rote application of the principles in the future. So you need to understand them. You need to understand that context. You need to bring that understanding to future contexts and use your knowledge to figure out how to draw it together. That is the idea. And I'm sure that there are people who've studied Mahan who are going to look at me and go, what? No, he's all about decisive battle and this stuff and bring the fleets together and never divide the fleet and those kind of things. So I trying to go a little bit farther and I think do Mahan a little bit more justice than he often gets. But there will probably be people who disagree with that point. Right.
Okay. But I think the reason perhaps I intuited that we might want to go there is because I think there's a direct parallel, and you touched on it towards the end of the book, about in our sort of agile world and how to build the adaptive organization, the agile organization, which of course is a big concern for a lot of companies right now, is that there tends to be this desire to jump straight to the instruction manual, how do I implement Scrum, or how do I do Lean, or whatever it might be, with perhaps less of an appetite to explore the history of the principles and where they come from and the broader context And sometimes we get, and there's another guy I could just think of, Dan North, who's a big thinker in the agile space, who's been on the show, and he talks about how a lot of these agile schools almost become like religions, and the people adhere to these religions based on, if you like, the instructions. What are the practices that we must subscribe to and engage in order to be a sort of valid congregational member of this religion, right? Without referring back to the principles and the philosophy behind it all. And I think you were touching on it there, that perhaps something that was that perhaps the US Navy did well, right? They sort of went through Nimitz, perhaps they sort of allowed themselves to go back to something more more of the sort of essence of the principles, and allowed for the doctrine to evolve in the context.
I think that's a wonderful point. I cannot help but be amused when you related agile to religion. There's a comparison I make as well. I sometimes joke that the best preparation I had to work in the agile space as we understand it today was to study religions, and to learn how people through time and history have taken religious ideas and then codified them in ways that create these structures that are more rigid and arguably less true to some of the aspirational ideas that were at the core of that religion when it was introduced or when it was founded. I think we run into the same sort of problem with agile. I agree completely. It is easy to get to a point where, well, we want to know how to do it, and we want to know how to do it right. We want, if not the instruction manual, then at least the guidebook, the pathway that is going to get us to where we want to go, and easily, and without as much effort, right? This is logical from an organizational standpoint, because you only have so much time, energy, and capacity, and you want to get to where you want to go. You want to get there as efficiently and effectively as possible. And I think people who work in the agile space often run up against this, because they know, well, it's not quite that easy. I can't just give you an instruction manual. I can't just tell you to do Scrum. We have to understand what's the context, where are we coming from, what are your objectives? We have to marry these things together. And where I feel like I've had the most success is where I take an approach that is similar to what I was describing with Mahan. Keep these ideas in mind, these principles, these concepts, but what I can bring as someone who works in organizations is I can help you tease out which of these principles are most important at the time to where you want to go, given your existing context. And I think that's what good agile work in the modern era does. Understands some of the foundational principles or concepts, whether we call these agile or lean or something else, complexity informed ideas, and help an organization figure out how to apply them into their context. I think we run into a lot of problems if we try to shortcut that and instead just say, well, here's the formula, let's apply it. Because that often looks great from a certain level of an organization, often a higher level, sometimes a lower level, but often a higher level. And then at the lower level, it's like, this doesn't work. This doesn't apply to our context. Why are we doing this? And it breeds a lack of enthusiasm, friction, and doesn't move forward quite as well.
Right. And you could argue that's exactly what the US Navy did at the start of that war for the Solomon Islands, or the battle for the Solomon Islands, is right. They came in with their doctrine that it was going to work, but perhaps we could say they failed fast, and they recognized quite quickly that they need to do something different. Is that a stretch?
It's a little bit of a stretch, but there's some truth to it, right? There is failure there. And I think what I think is a little bit flawed in that narrative is that there wasn't a cohesive formula at the beginning, right? This wasn't sort of
right.
This, here's the plan we're going to follow. Instead, it was, we're going to come into this with what we know, and we think it's going to work. Oh, gee, it doesn't. Okay, now how do we make this better? How do we fix? But I think they're faster to react to that learning. They're faster to react to it because there is the grounding in the principles, not necessarily the grounding in the rote procedures. And this is a place where it could effectively be contrasted with the primary opponent, the Imperial Japanese Navy, who is focused on less principles. Like, they're influenced by Mahan very much as well. He's translated into the Japanese, but
that's interesting. They're reading the same books.
Same books, but translated. And also they gravitate less toward the principles and more toward the decisive battle idea. Now, some of this is informed by their experience, right? They win the war with China through a decisive battle. They win the war with Russia in 1905 through a decisive battle. So they're focused on a decisive battle. And that informs how they approach the fighting in the Solomons. They know it's not the decisive battle, so they hold back a little bit. And whereas Nimitz is he's much more, all in, more of like a gambler. I know this is important. We have to win, so everything's on the table. Japanese hold back a little bit more, waiting for the decisive battle, because that is what their plan is centered around. And I think that inhibits their ability to recognize the importance of that fighting and what ultimately it's gonna do to them, because it trits their forces enough that then they get to a point where a decisive battle becomes much more challenging to win.
Right. Yeah. So that was part of the initial doctrine is act aggressively, right? That was part of the
So
the doctrine initially.
I like to think about it's not doctrine in the sense of the shared collaborative understanding that gets developed, more doctrine in terms of what is sort of the foundational principles of battle tactics that we're going to employ. And I call those heuristics after the work of Daniel Kahneman, subconscious decision criteria. And act aggressively is one. What's the other one? Attack effectively first, which I borrow from
attack effectively
Wayne Hughes
with firepower, right?
Yeah. Often with guns, but generally just attack effectively first. It applies to airplanes very much as well. And then the third one is decentralized doctrinal development or decentralized action, to take advantage of fleeting opportunities in battle. And you can see that through the interwar period and then in wartime as well. But that act aggressively. Now, you could argue that is a standard approach for militaries across the world. Right? It's a dynamic, challenging situation, and you have to impose your will on the enemy. But the way the Navy emphasized that, I think, is very important, because to the point of let's not reflect back, let's not think too much, just act, and then from that we will see what emerges, and then we can act again.
Yeah, but it's very much. But it is paired with this act, but then learn from it, right? But then write it up, then create the action report, send it back to this intelligence. This naval college, right? That's very important. And the reason I emphasize it is because it's something I see, a lot of in the organizations that I work, who are perhaps, you could say, struggling to become more agile, is they're very good at the acting part. They're very good at getting on with it. That's very, the sort of busyness addiction is sort of prevalent across, reality and generally, certainly in corporate life. And, but that stop and reflect and write the report and sit down and see what worked and didn't, that's much harder to inculcate, I find.
I think you're right. I'm really glad you said that, because one of the things that we can see from the Navy's experience is there's the sort of layers of reflection, right? I talked about the feedback loop that is happening amongst captains in the theater, but then there's a broader feedback loop. So there's layers to this. In many of the agile organizations that I've worked with, or organizations that are trying to become agile, some of those layers of reflection aren't necessarily interlinked effectively.
Or even there, right?
Well, or even there. Yes, absolutely. Right. Retrospectives are something the team does. They get to the end of their sprint and they do a retrospective, and then they learn. The rest of us, we don't have to do that. And I saw a valuable tweet the other day that it mirrors something that some colleagues of mine and I did. Like, we had a collection of teams, so it was a program, not just teams, and we had. We created a board for experimentation, different things that different teams are trying in a shared space, so everyone could see, what one team is trying and what, whether or not they felt it was successful once they got to the end of their experiment. And that was great because it shared information across the program. Different teams could see what their colleagues were doing, and so that was a very effective way for sort of creating another level of feedback loop to spread effective practice around more rapidly. Really liked that. So when organizations can have more time to reflect, or more capacity. It doesn't necessarily just have to be time. I think that's really important. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. Well, and they never have time. There's never any time to have a retrospective. It's the choice to create the time. It's the choice to commit to it, isn't it? That's really what it's about. Yeah, there is never a good time to sit around and reflect. And I think part of the reason is, you don't want to face your failure. And I think that's what perhaps something that military cultures are very good at, is encouraging people to face failure, right? Face it and be okay with it. And that, that's certainly been my experience, just sort of, not that I've ever been in any kind of military context, and just knowing a few people, they seem to be quite open about, we fucked that up, or we screwed that up, or, that happened. It's just, it seems to be just part of the culture, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it has to be. If you can't do that, then, the costs are quite high. I mean, it's different than sort of blowing a release. I used to have a colleague who we were tracking vehicles that did deliveries to various localities. And, if one of those screws up, right, somebody doesn't get their stuff on time, well, okay, that's a problem, right? But if you're like routing ambulances and you get that wrong, somebody might not get to the hospital in time. So the costs of that were a lot higher.
So perhaps to some extent it's adaptive to the cost of the failures. I can see that. Yeah. So we've I guess we've touched on some of the aspects and how this relates to specifically organizations working in agility. Are there any other common threads that you tend to find sort of transmute quite easily into corporate context?
Well, the one that I really wish translated more effectively, but it's very hard to find an organization that has the patience for this kind of thing, is the idea of parallel experimentation. And I refer back to how that is a part of complex domain, or guidance for the complex domain with the Cyenfin framework. Probes. I struggle to get organizations to think about that. Sometimes in a product development context, that will work because there's a recognition that there's uncertainty about what the best fit is going to be. But getting people out of the sort of linear assumption of, because I think a lot of people, especially if they've got an engineering background, they come to it from scientific context, right? We want to do controlled experimentation, so we'll hold various variables constant. We'll change one thing at a time. And the idea of running like 5 parallel probes to just get a better sense of, how does this thing actually react is alien. So, I mean, you asked for parallels, and I'm worried I'm going the opposite direction.
But it's good. And it reminds me of the first part of the book, which we haven't really touched on, when you talk about the sort of professionalization of the Navy and the fact that we're merging into the sort of engineer class and the officer class and making everybody effectively into like engineering soldiers or something. But there's this professionalization of it. But it's interesting that, I tend to get this idea in my head that the kind of engineering mindset is like the problem. And that's the thing that leads to us looking at everything as a machine and getting entrenched in this sort of linear way of thinking. But of course, what's interesting in the case of the Navy is that they're very happy, just de facto to think in terms of multiple probes and complex environments and, enabling constraints, right? Not that they're explicitly using those concepts and language, but they are operating in that way, right? And they all have engineering backgrounds.
Yeah, and that's something that I haven't fully reconciled, because I have a disposition very similar to yours, right? The engineering mindset is kind of the problem. This idea that we can decompose a problem into its component pieces. As if it's complex, we can't do that. It's the relationship between its pieces that really brings the essence of whatever it is, whether it's a problem, a challenge, or a system. And they seem to have been quite comfortable with that. And I'm not sure what it is about the education that they received, a little over a century ago, compared to what we do now, that allow that difference. But it's there. It's very real. I think part of it may have been what they get exposed to as junior officers, because they'll graduate from the Naval Academy in the United States, and then they will be put aboard ship, and they'll have some position of responsibility. Often these junior officers were gun captains responsible for a turret aboard a ship or some other small department. And when they come to that, they lack a lot of context, and very quickly they have to rely on the senior enlisted sailors who have been part of that environment for a long time, who know all the nuances and all the context about how this works. So they have this authority, they have this responsibility. They have to lead with a certain amount of humility, because if they piss those senior enlisted men off, if they get them upset, they're not going to be able to achieve their end. They have to come to their leadership in a way that respects the knowledge that those their subordinates, who know more than they do, bring. And I think that might have been something that forced them to think about challenge of human relationships in a context of engineering, right? So I understand the theories behind how this thing fits together, but this senior chief over here, he's been here for 10 years and he knows how it all really works. He knows like sort of where the flaws in the system are. He knows where the teething troubles are. He knows how to lubricate everything to make sure that it works. And I've got to command through him. So I've got to develop a sense of how do I navigate these personal relationships in order to accomplish my goals and command well. I don't know, but that's a theory that I have. That is something that made them very aware of the importance of human relationships and human dynamics to making their commands work.
Yeah, and I also wonder if that very rigid engineering mindset, in some senses, you kind of have the luxury to apply it when you're thinking about organizations, because you can set up a linear, you can view your organization as a machine and inputs and outputs. You can set up a program of activities, with the intention of reaching some outcome. And what happens, like we know from the statistics, what is it, 60% of projects fail or whatever, right? And so the whole kind of, if you like, management class with this engineering mindset is sort of hopeless, right? I mean, it's just failing at a mind-blowing degree. But everyone keeps their jobs, and it's not like it's almost like there's this sort of corporate denial that this is what happens, right? That we just fail almost every time we try and do, not quite, but a large portion of what we try and do as managers, as executives, when it comes to, let's say, changing organizations, we fail at. And it kind of doesn't matter. Whereas on a ship, it does matter, right? You couldn't get away with those levels of failure rates in a military context.
No, you can't. So there's what I was thinking when you were talking is there's a feedback loop, and the Navy is under pressure in this time frame because they finally get to a promotional approach that is going to reward good behavior. So the best are going to be promoted. Previously, in the late 19th century, naval officers would just get promoted in order no matter what. Right, wherever you graduate from Naval Academy, that gives you your number, and your numbers just advance, no matter how well you do, as long as you don't really screw things up. But then in the early 20th century, they changed to a promotional system that is very much based on merit, and it's very visible. Right, how well you do is visible, and so there's an incentive to do well. There's an incentive to figure out how to be effective with your own ship, and then after your ship, effective with the formation and other things. So they've got feedback loops that encourage that more effective behavior, greater than 60% success. And I think you're speaking to a point that is a real big challenge in business today. Is there are a lot of these failures, but oftentimes there isn't a lot of consequence for it.
Right. I know a guy who is now extremely senior CTO, and I love the guy. He's failed on practically every large program he's ever sort of sponsored. And it made no difference to his career, because he's a brilliant political operator and he's a, very bright mind and he's an inspiring leader and all the rest of it. But in terms of his track record of programs that he's been involved with, it's pretty much consistent with the statistic I just mentioned. And that's true of many of us, right? I mean, I can include myself, the number of programs I've worked on that's failed. It's not like it's endemic. I think that's the reality. But the consequences are fairly low.
Yeah, they are. And that's really interesting. But I think it makes it harder to try to figure out how to do things better. I mean, we're always searching for how to do things better. But what I mean is it makes it easier to do sort of the safe solution we were talking earlier about sort of agile as a religion, and do you adhere to the principles and try to bring those to context, or do you grab something off the shelf that is an approach that's going to work? And if there aren't that many consequences for failure, and if the principles are a very hard sell because it takes longer or it requires more effort, well, then why not grab the solution off the shelf and try that? And if it doesn't work, well, you'll probably fail up anyway. So no harm.
Exactly. Failing up. That's right. That encapsulates you failing up.
And that's kind of a cynical view. But I do think that sort of thing happens. I mean, I don't think it's unjustified.
No, I don't. I mean, it seems to be, again, because what I think one's ability to deliver project effectively is only part of your success criteria. A bit when you get into very large corporations, a much bigger component is political skill, and an ability to manage interactions and perceptions and so on. And it's relational ability. I think it becomes a big part of it. And interestingly, Ralph Stacey is another complexity thinker. It talks about that, right? That becomes so important in complex human environments. It's other factors are at play. So yes, it's interesting to reflect on that. But the other thing I will just say is that agile, it does appear that some of the statistics I've seen that these agile approaches are more successful. And that is one of the reasons I advocate it, even if regardless of that argument about are we sometimes applying these approaches too prescriptively, it's still in the aggregate a more successful strategy to take that approach to complex projects.
Yeah, it certainly has been in my experience. I remember bringing Agile to an organization, not as a consultant, but as a leader and as a manager to an organization that I worked with, and it great. It's so much better, I thought, than what we were doing before. So I do think that it does have its failures as well. It doesn't always succeed, but it makes the opportunities for improvement a lot more visible. And I think that's great. It creates the kind of feedback loops that organizations need to try to get better. And yeah, I mean, I've made a career out of it, so I must have some faith in it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we're still, I think we're still learning. I mean, I think, and it's interesting now for me, and perhaps by both of us have sort of latched onto this complexity thinking. It feels like it's a deepening of the understanding and the kind of context for this agile way of working, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I thought it was a wonderful frame for looking at what the Navy was doing in the early 20th century. I mean, the book draws on a series of articles that I had published in prior years, and I was thinking about how to tie them all together. And as I became more familiar with complexity thinking and Cyenfin, it was like, wow, this is the theme that provides a way of looking at this that not only ties it all together, but gives some very deep explanations for how some of this stuff works. And I'm just glad that other people have read the book and sort of reacted the same way. I mean, I felt a little bit like going out on a limb. It's like, I don't know that anybody's done this before. Apply complexity theory to naval history. But it worked.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful book. Yeah. Have we missed anything? Is there a question or a topic you would have thought I might have picked up on that we haven't touched on?
I don't think. Well, one thing I do want to stress that we haven't spent as much time about, but I do like to emphasize is we talked a lot about the wartime, and we talked about the sort of changing in the officer promotion approach and how they became engineering officers. But one thing that we haven't spent as much time on is in between the world wars, the Navy, I think, developed a real structure for learning that was influential when World War II came about. We talked about action reports and these feedback loops. And that really begins in the early 1920s when the Navy introduced something that they, this planning cycle, which was an annual feedback loop. And it culminated in these large exercises every year called fleet problems. And I think that's important for readers to understand, that the learning that Navy takes advantage of in World War II is established by these mechanisms that are created and introduced and then fostered and refined years before. So it's not just like there's a switch that gets flipped. it's years of preparation behind it.
Right. Yeah. And again, I think that is a parallel, and some of the more advanced, you might say, use that term with caution, but like agile organizations will tend to have those kind of annual, so it's this fractalized repeated patterns, right? You've got the Scrum team perhaps having a retrospect every couple of weeks, and maybe there's a broader unit that's reflecting perhaps with a slightly longer cadence, but then the organization itself might every 6 months or a year have like these mass participation events where you're really tapping into what's emerging and what's being learned and what we could be doing differently as an organization.
Right. And it's got a fractal scale to it. It sounds like you say that. But
yeah, I sometimes say that word because I'm not sure everybody understands it, but yeah, repeated patterns, right, at different scales. Yeah,
exactly. Self-similar patterns at different scales, and I think that is a nice model to think about as we think about how organizations could do things better.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Trent. I'll flash the book up again for those watching here. Learning War.
There it is.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. How long did it take you to write? I mean, I've never written a book. I'm always in awe of anybody who writes just a book. I'm just like, how on earth?
Well, there are different answers to that question. The long answer looks at when did I start the research that really in earnest that led into it, and that was sort of late 1990s. So that would be years if you want to factor it that way. If you want to think about it in terms of how long did it take to sort of sit down, commit to it, and actually come out with a book on the other side, that I think that's about 3 or 4
years. And any tips for budding writers out there? What, were you getting up at 5 a.m.? Writing before anyone gets up?
Not at 5 a.m., but lots of late nights and lots of weekends.
Weekends, right?
I find that it's really valuable to try to compartmentalize things. I've gotten some positive feedback about the book. The chapters are divided into sections, so there's sort of a modular nature to it. I tried to bring like an iterative and incremental approach to it, thinking about agile concepts, so that it has bits and pieces, not wholly reconfigurable, but being able to deal with it in components was easier for me to package it up and make sense of it.
Yeah. And I certainly found, as I said, with no background in any kind of understanding in these areas, I found it, very easy to read and comprehend. And, I think you lay it out in a way that a lay person can understand.
Thank you for that, because that's a very nice compliment. And that was something that I was aiming for. And that's the other thing that I think is really challenging about writing a book is, you come from your own context, and trying to figure out how to make it accessible to others can be really difficult. Fortunately, I had a number of people who assisted me with it. I try to thank them all in the acknowledgments, but they would read various chapters and give me some feedback about when I'd gone too far or hadn't gone far enough.
Good. And then of course the other book that we mentioned at the Cyenfin book is great, and there's your chapter in there is excellent. So we'll put the links to everything, and Exceler as well, the firm of which you're a fellow, into the description for the show if people want to hire you, I suppose, or your firm to come and apply some of this thinking. Great. All right. Well, thanks again. Wonderful conversation.
Yes, really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.